So, welcome everybody to tonight's talk, which is going to be Eight Birds and a Boy from Selbourne, Gilbert White's Formative Years and the Vernacular Ornithology of Rural England, which is being given by John Rumm. John Rumm is a very knowledgeable ornithologist and a very experienced researcher who's the author of a number of books, and he is particularly interested in the history of bird watching and in the research and writing of significant figures in natural history, of whom Gilbert White is clearly one. So I'm going to hand over now to John for this evening's talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Marie. Thank you to the London Natural History Society. I would be remiss if I stated that I am not an ornithologist. I'm a historian and a longtime bird watcher. But anyway, I do want to thank a few people before I start. First of all, my dear wife, Lynn Stallings, who is also a historian, but also a gifted editor. This talk has been greatly improved because of her. And three colleagues of mine in Britain, Jeremy Minot, Stephen Moss, and Anne Secord, each of whom has been a great resource to me, and I appreciate very much their help. So this talk is, in a nutshell, a phrase that I think some of you may be familiar with. You can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy. So in birding parlance, a patch, some of you may know this book by Dominic Cousins. A patch, more properly called a local patch, is the place we do most of our bird watching. It's our bird watching home. And you become familiar with the birds and animals that are there. You notice when something has changed. And another book, this one older, by W.H. Hudson, a name I'm sure many of you know. The village formed the headquarters and center of a paradise of birds. He's talking not about Selbourne, although he visited Selbourne, but in another village very much like it. And as you all know, in 1720, Gilbert White was born in Selbourne, a village about 80 miles southwest of London. I had the pleasure of visiting it for the first time back in June when I gave an earlier version of this talk. And White's book, The Natural History of Natural History and Antiquities, actually the Natural History of Selbourne, of his patch, appeared in 1789, and as it says, has been in print ever since. Something like 300 editions have come out. White spent the first 2 decades of his life in or around Selbourne. He went away to Farnham, not too far away, for his kind of elementary schooling, and then to Basingstoke. But he spent virtually the entire time in Selbourne, and those other areas are within a few miles of it. So for all intents and purposes, when I refer to Selbourne, I'm talking about that area, including the village itself. As he said in his first published letter, the region I live in is a very abrupt, uneven country full of hills and woods, and therefore full of birds, a great area for bird watching. And over the course of a lifetime that he spent in that village and in this area that teemed with birds, White became a good ornithologist. As he says, a good ornithologist should be able to distinguish birds by their air, as well as by their colors and shape on the ground, as well as on the wing, and in the bush, as well as in the hand. He goes on from there. And when he says, by the way, when he says birds by their air, he's talking about the way that they live. But although he didn't claim the title for himself, certainly he merited the title of a good ornithologist. He's gotten other titles too. First bird watcher, the man who started us all bird watching. He's also been called the father of ornithology. Those are just a few of the honorifics that he earned. So birds are everywhere. They're all around us. And how do we learn to know them? How do we get to know the birds? I've been a lifelong bird watcher. I'm a historian of science. And about 15 years ago, I became interested in ways of combining my historical training with my love for birds. And I became interested, and am still interested in, when people began learning about birds, how they come to know them. These are from me. These are from when I was about 5 years old, living in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I made my own field guide. I drew pictures. I had this now very battered little golden nature guide to birds. And in our time, beginning bird watchers have a whole raft of things at their disposal in order to become, if they so choose, to aspire to become good ornithologists: binoculars, field guides, spotting scopes, journals, checklists, apps, and guides and mentors who take them on field trips. I'm sure many of you have had most of these assets at your disposal, if not all of them. But as I've read through various editions, and these are my copies of White's Natural History of Selbourne, I became curious about when and how he began learning about birds. During White's time, there was a rich popular culture about birds. You see some illustrations here of different pamphlets. The illustration in the center is from a children's book. Interestingly, if you can you notice in the lower right-hand corner, it categorizes bats as being birds. But there was this really robust, flourishing popular culture about birds. On the other hand, the science of ornithology, as Gilbert White himself said, was in its infancy. These excellent men, Francis Willoughby and John Ray, wrote when the Ornithology of England, and indeed the natural history, was quite in its infancy. White, he didn't have binoculars. He may have had a telescope, but there's no indication that he used it to watch birds. Certainly didn't have any field guides. He had no other tools like that to help him learn about birds. And it's also likely, based on the research I've done, that it was not until the 1750s that he even saw any scientific works about birds and ornithology. Instead, he relied upon the testimony of his senses, which he referred to as the most immediate, quickest, and surest means of knowledge. So it was essentially what he did by listening and by looking. In a kind of a famous letter he wrote, this is also the first published one to Pennant in August of 1767, "It has been my misfortune never to have had any neighbors whose studies have led them towards the pursuit of natural knowledge, so that for want of a companion to quicken my industry and sharpen my attention, I have made but a slender progress in a kind of information to which I have been attached from my childhood." So take White at face value, and we believe that he's being correct when he says he had no companions. Selbourne was a very isolated area. That's not surprising, but I think there's more to it than that. I think that his pursuit of natural knowledge was profoundly shaped by the rustic attitude. As W.J. Keith said, the rustic attitude and flavor of rural things in his native Selbourne. These are probably the primary biographies of White, and his biographers and others have written about him have commented upon the lack of anecdotes or memories from his formative years. His childhood is usually disposed of in a couple of pages, and beyond the bare facts of how many siblings he had, who his parents were, the different places he lived, and the schools he attended, that's pretty much it. There is not much else to say, or so it would appear. And yet, a close read of his writings, especially the original manuscript for the Natural History of Selbourne, yields several memories about birds from his formative years. And each of these memories, I think, offers insights into how White paid attention to birds during his childhood, how he came to know them, but they also offer a window into the vernacular ornithology of rural England in the first half of the 18th century. So vernacular ornithology, or folk ornithology, is how rural cultures observe, classify, name, and interact with birds. And that's true today, It's true really since prehistory in terms of how rural people have related to birds in different ways. As Nancy Jacobs said in this book, Bird of Africa, it's the oldest tradition of knowing birds. All over the world, foragers, herders, healers, farmers have always interacted with the birds around them, observing them, chasing them from crops, hunting them for food, using them for decoration, noting their augury powers, and using their bodies for cures and rituals. There's this whole body of practices and ways of knowing that are associated with vernacular ornithology. Here's a little chart with some comparisons that vernacular ornithology is the collective well-being and relations between humans and birds. It's defined in terms of practical, symbolic, social, spiritual, or cultural utility. On the other hand, scientific ornithology is based on the classification of birds on the basis of presumed evolutionary relationships, and it's a universal classification. The basis for vernacular ornithology is really sensory perceptions. Again, the things we take in through our senses, through personal interactions. Scientific ornithology tends to be based on specimen analysis, dead birds, and from them extracting DNA, looking at anatomy, morphology, and also more recently, field studies of living birds. Vernacular ornithology tends to be informal. Scientific ornithology, very rigid. Taxonomy for vernacular is very localized, global for scientific, and so on. And lastly, in terms of how they're disseminated, vernacular tends to be done on the basis of oral transmission, where literacy exists, supplanted, I should say, with popular literature, whereas scientific ornithology is primarily in the form of publications distributed in print or electronic form, and also in terms of teaching. So rural culture in White's England was undergoing this transition. As Keith Thomas said, vernacular knowledge of the natural world was soon eclipsed by the more thoroughgoing inquiries of the scientists. His viewpoint was not narrowly utilitarian, and who rapidly became disillusioned to discover that there were limits to natural curiosity. So this notion of eclipsing, that vernacular knowledge is giving way to a more scientific knowledge. So there's this wonderful anecdote, which not many people seem to have picked up on in the natural history of Selbourne. White's talking about the Hagley slip, a chunk of a hillside came down, and he talks about reading Baker's Chronicles. And he said, when I was a boy, I used to read with astonishment and implicit assent accounts of walking hills and traveling mountains, and he gave credit to such stories. But when I came to consider better, I began to suspect that though our hills may never have journeyed, the ends of many of them have slipped and fallen away. And in 1774, the fall of a considerable part of the great woody hanger at Hagley justified my suspicions. So there's three phases there, which I think can be applied as a framework to understanding how Gilbert Knowledge learned about birds. Implicit assent, how as a child he became steeped in and largely accepted the vernacular knowledge and attitudes about birds that existed among the country people of Selbourne. Years of considering better, he went to Oxford. He then traveled through southern and central England and began to think more critically and question his prior beliefs. And lastly, the years of justifying suspicions, where he's back full-time at Selbourne, he began applying scientific methods to his studies of birds, especially with an eye towards verifying or rejecting his and others' assumptions. And so, again, using that notion of eclipsing, this kind of little diagram about White, implicit assent, considering better, and justifying suspicions. I would say that it wasn't a total eclipse for him in terms of justifying suspicions through the end of his life. There were still elements of vernacular ornithology that he clung to, most notably his refusal or grudging acceptance is maybe a better way to put it, that birds, at least some birds migrated, particularly his beloved swallows. He still believed that they hibernated. So this talk is going to focus on phase one, the years of implicit assent, and I'm going to talk about 8 birds in the form of 7 memories that White referred to in the Natural History of Selbourne, and what we can learn from these memories of his. So this first one, black grouse. When I was a very little boy, I remember now and then one coming to my father's stable. So there was a nobler species of game in Wilmington Forest, not far from Selbourne, now extinct, and that was the black-cock, black gamer grouse. When I was a very little boy, I remember now and then one coming to my father's table. Well, it didn't walk to the table. It was brought there. And what kinds of things can we learn from, what insights does this memory offer? First of all, birds were mostly regarded as sources of food, and not just game birds, but just about any kind of bird. Thrushes, larks, nightingales, and other songbirds. Pretty much anything that flew or swam was regarded as fair game, so to speak. Secondly, as was the custom, was probably White's father that introduced Gilbert to hunting birds for food or sport, certainly by the time he reached adolescence. As a young gentleman, he was expected to become proficient in hunting birds. And that hunting birds entail not only marksmanship, but also fieldcraft, which is not simply the ability to get close to birds so you can flush them or they don't fly away before you get close enough to them to shoot, but it also means learning where birds lived, what their haunts were, and observing them in their haunts to learn how they lived, what their habits are. And I think that may have come into effect for White in his later years as he became seriously interested in the lives and conversations of birds. And lastly, even during his formative years and as he grew older, he would note the toll that hunting was taking on birds, especially the black grouse, which, as he said, was hunted to extinction. They abandoned much before shooting, flying became common. But the last pack, remember, was killed about 35 years ago. So he's noting changes happening in the landscape as hunting is taking a greater toll on birds. So just some visual things that come out of this. Unless he was a hunter, no young person was allowed to be possessed of manhood or gallantry. White certainly wanted to be possessed of manhood or gallantry and learned to shoot and loved shooting. He was one of his favorite pursuits was shooting birds. And these are examples of game birds that he would have learned in his boyhood: partridge, pheasant, lapwing, wild duck, landrake, woodcock. There were others too, but these were among the ones that he would have hunted as a boy. The principlest thing to learn is the knowledge of the haunts. This is from an old Falling manual. The knowledge of the haunts or places of residence. The illustration there is of Wilmington Forest. White said it's this lowland domain is a very agreeable haunt for many sorts of wild fowls, which not only frequent in winter, but head there in the summer, such as lapwings, snipes, and wild ducks. Throughout the Natural History of Selbourne, he time and time again is referring to birds in terms of their haunts, in terms of where they live. And I think that's something he very early learned to associate what birds lived where, even to the point of what birds live high up in trees, what birds live in the middle part of trees, what birds live in lower parts of trees. So a second memory. Many were the attempts of the neighboring youths to get at this eyrie. There stood an oak with a large swelling about the middle of the stem. On this oak, a pair of ravens had fixed their residence for such a series of years that the oak was called the Raven Tree. Many were the attempts of the neighboring youth to get at this eyrie. The difficulty whetted their inclinations, but when they arrived at the swelling, it jutted out so far in their way, and was so far beyond their grasp, that the most daring lads were awed, and acknowledged the undertaking to be too hazardous. White doesn't refer to himself in this sense, but I believe it's about him. The level of detail about what happened, I think, is not the kind of thing he would have heard from other people. I think he actually was one of the people who tried scaling a tree to get this nest down. In his Natural History of Selbourne, he wrote at times in the third person about embarrassing or potentially embarrassing incidents from his own youth. This anecdote from the Antiquities, where when a schoolboy more than 50 years ago, he was eyewitness, perhaps a party concerned, in an undermining of that fine old ruin at the north end of Basingstoke town. You have to read White in the third person at times and think he's probably referring to himself in that regard. And I believe this anecdote about the raven is one that he himself took part in. And raiding birds' nests to steal eggs and nestlings was widely regarded as an acceptable form of recreation and amusement for rural children. It was true in his time. It was true in England well into the early decades of the 20th century. And people in rural areas often assign birds' names to local places, natural features, landmarks, and objects. So again, children and bird nesting, this poem here, to find their secret haunts will I, this day no labor spare, in every bush and brake I'll pry, though I may close, may tear. It's kind of an homage to birds nesting. And the painting over there from 1789. Again, this was widely seen as an acceptable pursuit to go and maraud, basically, the birds' nests. Place names. This marvelous site, if you're not familiar with it, the Birds and Places Project, funded by Michael Warren, which is totaling up names of birds. There's 250 names associated with ravens, vernacular names, and place names associated with ravens. This is an enormous part of rural or vernacular bird culture, is the naming of things. And certainly that was true in White's time, and he was familiar with some of them. A third memory, the wood pigeon. In former times, the flocks were so vast. In former times, the flocks of wood pigeons were so vast that in mornings and evenings they traversed the air like rooks in strings, reaching for a mile together. If they happened to be suddenly roused from their roost trees in an evening, their rising all at once was like the sound of thunder heard remote. He's quoting a classical allusion there. So what about this? It's another example of how White would witness a sharp decline in the numbers of certain birds, in this case, wood pigeons, partly because of hunting. I mean, they were hunting in massive numbers, but also the beech woods, which they love, were being cut down and cleared away. And so White, again, was noticing these birds were rapidly declining during his lifetime, and particularly his early lifetime. Secondly, orality, the quality and experience of hearing, birds' songs, birds' calls, birds' cries, and the other sounds, the enormous sound of thunder that a flock of wood pigeons taking off all at once. Orality was a primary means to which White encountered birds in rural England. Bird sounds fill the hearer's mind with a strain of summer ideas of everything that is rural. As he said, in a district so diversified as this, so full of hollow vales and hanging woods, it is no wonder that echoes should abound. Many have we discovered that return the melody of birds very agreeably. We are more apt to be captivated with the associations sounds produce than with the notes themselves. This marvelously delights some hearers, filling their minds with a strain of summer ideas of everything that is rural, verdurous, and joyous. Again, White, I'm sure, is thinking of himself there about any time he would hear a bird, would associate other memories of his from his youth. The pleasing noises and little intimations arising from rural sounds. In later life, he began to have bouts of deafness, and how they incommode me sadly and half disqualify me for a naturalist. For when those fits are upon me, I lose all the pleasing notes and little intimations arising from rural sounds, and May is to me as silent and mute. with respect to the notes of birds as August. Very touching tribute to the power that sound had for him. And if you've been to Selbourne, it's still very open, and you can imagine how sound would carry. And I suspect that for Gilbert White, the fascination with birds grew out of the sounds because they were so present all day long and even all night long. Listening to the sounds of birds at twilight, when day declining sheds a milder gleam, when time the mayfly haunts the pool or stream, when the still owl slims round the grassy mead, what time the timorous hare limps forth to feed, then be the time to steal adown the vale and listen to the vagrant's cuckoo's tale, to hear the clamorous curlew call his mate, or the soft quail his tender pain relate. White famously wrote these lines in a poem, The Naturalist's Summer Evening Walk, which he presented to Thomas Pennant. But again, it reflects decades of hearing birds from his boyhood and ever since. Amuse of birds, he says in that same poem, say where your hid retreat. And these are some of the birds that he got to know by their sounds. Curlews, titlarks, brown wood owls, and many, many others. Fourth memory, blue tit. When a boy, I have known 20 caught with snap mouse traps. The blue titmouse, or blue nun, is a great frequenter of houses and a general devourer. When a boy, I have known 20 in a morning, caught with snap mouse traps, baited with tallow or suet. Insights from this memory. With this colorful plumage, the propensity for frequenting areas near houses and relative tameness, the blue tit was probably one of the first birds White would come to know. There were gardens right outside his house, and I'm sure that this was one of the very first birds he saw. Contemporary gardeners' manuals instructed landowners on how to deal with bird pests, including young children, to set bird traps. Landowners and farmers regarded many birds, especially songbirds, as pests because of how they marauded fruit trees, crops, and plant buds. And lastly, White's allusion to, quote, blue nun, unquote, indicates his familiarity with, even at an early age, with the vernacular names that country people use for birds. Birds as agricultural pests, this is just one of many examples of agricultural manuals from the late 17th and early 18th centuries that went on at length about birds as pests. Goldfinches, very injurious to gooseberry buds, chaffinches, greenfinches, titmice, sparrows. You know, they're a pest. They deserve to be dealt with. All sorts of ways, this entire book, Vermin Killer, being a companion for all families, showing a ready way to destroy adders, badgers, birds of all sorts, on, had all these illustrations about different ways to deal with birds. This is when bird liming becomes a practice, using nooses, using traps, using hooks to keep birds away. Rural children were employed to trap or scare away birds. When Gilbert White said that he saw 20 in a trap, it's very possible that he himself set those traps, or certainly knew other boys his age who were in charge of setting traps. And there were also children hired to be bird watchers, would be hired by farmers to police the fields and to make noises with rattles or whatever, wave their arms to drive away birds. So I say here, it's a boy, the first bird watcher may have known boys who actually watched birds, were hired to watch birds. And in keeping with his rural attitude and rural upbringing, White as an adult would still destroy birds that marauded his garden. This line from his garden calendar: he destroyed 20 bullfinches, which lay very hard on the cherry trees and plum trees, and had done a great deal of mischief. He had no scruples about killing birds that were attacking his garden. It was a way of life for him. Another insight from this memory is about vernacular bird names. Vivid vernacular names with which ordinary people had been in the habit of identifying the birds around them. And White, in this letter in the Antiquities of Selbourne, says many circumstances concur to prove Selbourne a Saxon village, such as a variety of names in husbandry and common life still subsisting among the country people. It would be useless to instance such names in every circumstance. He that wishes for more specimens must frequent a farmer's kitchen. This wonderful painting shows a farmer's wife with a raven, maybe not the same raven that was in the tree that got cut down. These are examples of just some examples of vernacular bird names that White learned as a boy, and as is evidenced in his journals, continued using well into the 1770s and 1780s. Dakerhen, swinepipe, windhover, ruddock, stormcock, queast, puckeridge, and my favorite, sit ye down. Just many vernacular names. And again, he would have learned the names of these birds by hearing them, by the villagers, by his family members, by his friends. They were how he would have referred to birds for at least for the first 4 decades of his life. A fifth memory, Western barn owl. We have had ever since I remember a pair of white owls. We have had ever since I can remember a pair of white owls that breed under the eaves of our church. The white owl does indeed snore and hiss in a tremendous manner. I have known a whole village up in arms on such an occasion, imagining a churchyard to be full of goblins and specters. White likely knew this bird in his youth as white owl. Barn owl wasn't assigned to it until later. He may have known it by other folk names: church owl, death owl, demon owl, banshee, gill hooter. Names were popular in southern England. As a boy, White took a keen interest in the nesting behavior of birds and learned to recognize their nests. He lightly had himself in mind when he told Daines Barrington, "Every species has a mode of nidification peculiar to itself, so that a schoolboy could at once pronounce on a sort of nest before him." And lastly, the vernacular knowledge that he and other people possessed included beliefs and superstitions that offered common sense explanations for curious or mystical natural phenomena. So the church tower, St. Mary's Church, across the way, direct line of sight from the wakes, attracted a variety of birds, rooks, ravens, jackdaws, and so on, became White's one of his favorite spots to observe birds. With regard to prejudice, and again, you have to imagine him saying in the first person this, "It is the hardest thing in the world to shake off superstitious prejudices. They are sucked in, as it were, with our mother's milk, and growing up with us at a time when they take the fastest hold and make the most lasting impressions, become so interwoven into our very constitutions that the strongest good sense is required to disengage ourselves from them. No wonder, therefore, that the lower people retain them their whole lives through, since their minds are not invigorated by liberal education." Well, there's that considering better coming into play there. Country people have a notion that the fern owl, or eave jar, which they also call a puckeridge, is very injurious to weaning cattle by inflicting, as it strikes them, a fatal distemper known as cow leeches. White here is making it clear that he doesn't believe this, at least he doesn't believe it anymore. But in his time, certainly people believed that goat suckers would steal the milk from goats. These are examples of folklore that was still common in Selbourne during White's formative years. Swans hatch only during thunderstorms. The loud thunder is their eggs cracking. Magpies, if one perches on your roof, your house won't fall down. If you see a tree with a magpie's nest in it, it is never known to fall. If you hear a cuckoo in the spring, you'll be poor for the rest of your life unless you turn over a coin in your pocket, and so on. There were lots of superstitions in that time in Selbourne. Last memory, this in some ways is one of my favorites. House swallow. When I was a boy, I observed the swallow for a whole day. The house swallow appears in general on or about the 13th of April, but now and then a straggler is seen much earlier. When I was a boy, I observed the swallow for a whole day on a Sunday warm Shrove Tuesday, that is, early in February, or not later than middle of March. White spent his formative years at a time and place in which people frequently overlooked common natural occurrences. So, to me, that he noticed this is pretty remarkable. Being the son of a gentleman gave White time for leisure, which, along with his own curiosity, led him to take up the study of nature a little and to habituate my mind to attend to the observation of birds. He began noting and tracking the dates when swallows and other birds of passage appeared each spring. And in 1776, he urged his young nephew, Samuel Barker, to do likewise. But the idea that White, as a boy, would, number one, notice a swallow flying around in February and be able to realize, hey, this shouldn't be here now, and then would spend an entire day simply watching that swallow is just a remarkable testament to his fascination with birds. The last memory, which is of two birds, fieldfare and redwing. I well remember after that dreadful winter of 1739-40. It's not food alone which determines whether some species of birds stay or depart. Fieldfares and redwings disappear sooner or later according as the warm weather comes on earlier and later. For I well remember after that dreadful winter, 1739-40, that cold northeast winds continued to blow on through April and May, and that these birds, what few remained of them, did not depart as usual, but lingered about till the beginning of June. So it was a dreadfully cold winter, one of the worst in England's memory. The Thames froze over. It was bitter cold. So White was there. He was actually supposed to have started at Oxford in the spring of 1739, but his mom passed away. And so he delayed leaving until 1740. So he was there. He was able to see the birds that were the few fieldfares and redwings that survived the cold. They lingered on. He wasn't sure why. Why didn't they depart like they usually did? Why did they remain? What was the circumstance? Was it peculiar to Selbourne? It happened elsewhere? Might there be some other factor than food, which would determine why some species stayed and others left? He knew that such questions couldn't be answered by staying in Selbourne. He was ready to embark upon a more serious and sustained effort to expand his knowledge of birds. So this is an article from Gentleman's Magazine in 1748. And he wrote pennant in a passage that does not appear in the Natural History of Selbourne. It was deleted, but it's in the original manuscript. If you know where to have recourse to a complete set of Gentleman's magazines, I could wish you would look, while you are on the subject of migration, for a dissertation on fieldfares. I can't pretend to say what year it appeared. It may be 20 years ago. I only remember it gave me great satisfaction. This talked about, this article, about how fieldfares migrate, how they may stay sometimes, and how their arrival and departure times vary. That he remembered 20 years after reading it that it made an impression on him is pretty significant. But it shows how he was beginning to think more seriously about birds, think more like a scientist or a naturalist. So by 1739, the year that he turned 20, he, I think, knew about 60 species of birds. These lists are put together later, but these are the birds that he would have gotten to know in and around Selbourne. And he noticed things that people missed. People that live in the country would take little pains. Daily observations might be made with respect to animals, which are the life and end of natural history. And so he's ready to depart for university, and he's now the young gentleman from Selbourne and about to embark upon a more scientific study of birds. And just to give a quick nutshell of the other phases. In phase 2, He visited a number of places. He shifted his interest and attention from being a sportsman to becoming a naturalist. At Oxford, he spent time watching birds around the campus and visited nearby meadows and woodlands and so forth to observe birds. He traveled extensively through parts of southern and central England into areas that were favorable for seeing migrating birds. When he was back home, he continued his observations of local species, tracking their arrivals and departures, deepened his interest in questions relating to migration, and acquired in the 1750s his first ornithological text. In phase 3, the years of considering seriously, informed by Ray's synopsis, he developed his own methodus, the way of organizing ornithological information, starting with the Flora Sorbeniensis, continuing with the Naturalist Journal. He began documenting faithfully the lives and conversations of birds, begins corresponding with a network of naturalists, particularly Pennant and Barrington, draws upon his familiarity with bird calls and microhabitats to confirm a suspicion that 2 species of willow wren were actually 3, discovered the petichaps or lesser yellowthroat, made sustained long-term observations to verify that birds of passage migrated internally within England, but as I say, remained hopeful at the end that swallows hibernated, supplanted his field observation with autopsies of birds, pioneered in writing monographic accounts, and began documenting the range expansions and occurrences. So he's definitely now an ornithologist as opposed to the boy he was. He never ceased progressing in his efforts to learn about birds. He continued a journey that lasted a lifetime. He says, 1779 is now more than 40 years that I have paid some attention, by that he means scientific attention, to the ornithology of this district without being able to exhaust the subject. New occurrences still arise as long as any inquiries are kept alive. And I think that's a nice way to end, this idea that we're always learning. We always keep the spirit of inquiry alive, no matter where we are or what we do. Okay, and with that, I thank you.